In this video, I'm going to show you guys how to make a Texas-style brisket that's so delicious, so juicy, so barky and smoky that even Barbecue Jesus will be proud of you. Well, maybe not, but I'll be proud of you. I asked my viewers what makes a Texas-style brisket, and their unanimous response was post oak, salt, pepper. And also super dark bark, juicy, tender, perfectly cooked, but mainly post oak, salt, pepper. And there's obviously one other important ingredient to a Texas-style brisket, and that's the brisket. This is a 12 to 15 pound brisket. I honestly don't even check what the weight is anymore. If it looks about this size, it's fine with me. As long as it is in the range of 12 to 15 pounds, you're good to go. I like to cut the vac seal bag. This isn't really vac sealed right now. For some reason, something happened to my vac seal bag. But I like to cut it on the back so you're not scoring the fat cap. And I just give it a cut like that, a little cut like this. And the reason I'm doing this is because I kind of want to lift the brisket out of the vac seal because I don't want to pull it out and then have all the juices come out. So I'm just going to pull this out of the vac seal bag, drip all those juices back in, and you'll kind of see that there's a couple of crystals that are forming on my brisket because it's been frozen in my freezer for about 2 hours. Not enough to make it super, super frozen, but enough to firm up the fat. And that is gonna make it really easy to carve and trim. Now, I like to use a giant slicing knife because it's really sharp and it has a lot of surface area, and it prevents me from gouging the brisket. When I'm using something like this, it's easier for me to wanna dig into certain areas and poke and prod and cut. This keeps everything nice and smooth and looking aerodynamic. So the first thing that I'm going to do is, usually I like to just trim off the end of the flat. So I'll just draw out a line here of what I want the brisket to look like. So we'll go like that. It's probably gonna look like that, and we'll go around there. Okay, so you can see a rough outline. And the reason that I'm going to cut all of this flat meat off is because it's really thin and it's not gonna survive the cook really well. It's gonna get dry, and grandpa or grandma or your dad are gonna take a slice from the end of this brisket, they're gonna eat it, and they're gonna say, "Jimmy, your brisket is so dry." So the reason we cut that off is to prevent people from saying that. And so we have a nice thick flat and it cooks evenly and nothing gets dry throughout the cook. So I'm gonna go ahead and just trim that off. All right, so this is what we're left with. You can separate this fat cap here from the rest of the meat. You can use the meat for sausages, burgers. You can render down the fat for tallow. That's what I do. I have a ton of tallow right now, and it's really great for wrapping the brisket, which I'll show you later in this video. So now that we've got a nice thick flat, what I want to do is I want to shave down this fat cap because, as you can see, this fat cap is really thick. That's over 1 inch thick, right? So we want to get this down so it is about 1/4 inch thick. So we're going to get it down so it's about right here. I'm going to make a little line here. Now normally I wouldn't do this, but I'm just showing it for educational purposes. So that's all the fat we want to remove. That's the fat we want to keep. About 1/4 inch, maybe just over 1/4 inch. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start with this large piece of fat on the flat, and I'm just going to make nice little shave cuts. I'm going to use the entire length of my blade, and I'm just going to slowly cut through, and I've taken a piece of fat off, and you'll notice that I could have gone a lot deeper. I could have gone a lot deeper into that fat, but the problem is the fat cap isn't consistently thick over the entire flat. So we want to just shave off little bits as we go so we don't dig too deep into the brisket and expose the meat. So I'm just going to continue to make little shave cuts here. And see how this knife is nice and long, so I'm getting a nice smooth surface. And it just cuts like a dream. Especially because this thing is a little bit frozen. It's been in the freezer for a bit. So I'm just going to keep going. Keep cutting as we go up to the point. And usually what I sort of aim for is the 1/4 inch thickness on the fat cap, and I like to kind of shave off most of the right side of the flat here. This is where it gets thick, and then it kind of dips down here a little bit. And this is where you might not even have to trim it at all, because the fat cap is probably only even less than a 1/4 inch thick right here. So a lot of people might cut into this thinking it's going to be thick, and then they scalp the brisket so that there's meat showing, and then you get a lot of moisture pushing up through the meat, and it creates a bald spot in your bark. So you don't want that. The other thick part is around here, and especially right here. You can see it's a little bit thicker as it goes up into the point here. Moving on to the point, you'll notice on some briskets have this removed, but this is called the flap. And what can happen is this gets pushed over and vac sealed, and it actually looks like part of the brisket. But halfway through the cook, this thing will re-emerge, and you'll open up your cooker and you'll notice that this huge flap has appeared on your brisket, and you'll think, oh wow, did the butcher make a huge slice here accidentally? But actually what happened is this flat was just pressed down, and you just need to remove it from the outset. So what we're gonna do is just remove this entire flap here. And again, turn that into burgers or sausage. And then we're gonna deal with this large hump here. So this sticks out quite a bit from the brisket. It's a lot of fat, it's a lot of really hard fat. So what we wanna do is we wanna carve that down. I just like to kind of aerodynamically carve it and just slice the fat off to a 1/4 inch thickness. If you have a lot of fat on the point, especially because this side of the brisket gets a lot of heat from the offset smoker firebox, this fat is going to crisp up a lot, and it's going to get really rendered, it's going to get really crispy, and it's going to create what's called sugar cookie bark. And sugar cookie bark is this really succulent style of brisket fat that you kind of bite into, and it's fully rendered, but it's also crispy. And that is how you get sugar cookie bark, with this big hump here. And you expose it to a lot of heat, and you just let it bake in the fire in the offset smoker, and it'll be awesome. Now that our fat cap is done, we're gonna flip the brisket over, and you'll notice that there's 2 chunks of hard fat. One is right here, and there's another one right here. This is really hard fat. It's not gonna render really well, and even if it does render, no one's gonna eat it anyway because it's just a big chunk of fat. So we're going to slice this entire thing off. There we go. And I'm fine with leaving a little bit of it in because it just helps the brisket cook a little bit more evenly. It protects the edges from getting dried out. And if you carve into here, depending on how your brisket is marbled, this thing could go all the way into the seam fat, and you could get a really large divot in the middle of your brisket. So I just leave that there for kind of structural integrity. And then this other piece of hard fat here can get carved out as well. It's pretty easy to take this one out. Just again, take slices. And you'll see a lot of pit masters really clearly and confidently slice through a brisket and sort of just slice off an entire huge piece of fat. That comes with experience. What I like to do is, because I am mainly teaching beginners, and this is the way that I started trimming brisket, I sort of just shave it. I shave off a little bit, and that way if you scalp the brisket a little bit, you can correct. Because if you're taking a huge chunk out, then you might make a huge scalp mark and not have any fat covering that area. So I kind of like to make just little shaves at a time. Now, same thing with this side. You can see that on this particular brisket, this seam fat goes all the way down into the area between the flat muscle here and the point here. So it's pretty thick all the way throughout. So if I keep carving, eventually I'm just going to separate the point of the flat, and we don't want that. So I dig a little bit deep here, but I don't start making a crevasse into the brisket. If I wanted to, I could kind of carve all of this out, and then you'd have a big V-style divot. But I don't want to do that because I want the brisket to be nice and aerodynamic and uniform. So the last thing we're going to do on the bottom is remove any silver skin. This silver skin is kind of a bluish type transparent film, and you want to carefully slice that off, removing as little meat as possible. It helps to cut with the grain. I don't know why. It just is easier. So if you cut with the grain, it'll come off pretty easily, especially with a sharp knife. And the reason we're removing this silver skin is because it doesn't render at all. It doesn't render, and it'll actually tighten up and it can curl up the brisket. So, nice little slices. It's okay if you remove a little bit of meat. Just try to be as careful as possible, keeping as much meat as possible on the brisket. And the butcher actually did a pretty good job on this, with removing the silver skin, so less work for me. Now, one thing I did notice is this flat is a little bit too thin for my liking. So what I'm going to do is I am going to, again, make a little bit more of a rounded brisket. I'll probably cut it right there because this side of the flat is really thick. That's fine. But this side of the flat is really thin. There we go. And so now you can see it's a lot thicker and it's a lot more even all the way throughout the flat. And now I'm going to round out the point a little bit. Sometimes you get a really pointy point and it is really easy to get burnt up during the cook. All right, there we go. I'm happy with that. The final step is just to trim up all the rough edges. So for example, you can see this is kind of poking up. So I might come in with my slicing knife and just carefully kind of taper the edges. All right, folks, this brisket is fully trimmed now, and you can see he's looking absolutely gorgeous. This is one of the best briskets I've ever trimmed. You can see that he's lost a lot of weight. He's now ready to hit the beach, pick up some ladies. We're gonna get him on the smoker, but first, we're going to dress him up with some salt and pepper. Before we get to the next step, I want to thank ZBiotics for sponsoring this video. ZBiotics is a probiotic drink that breaks down the byproduct of alcohol, which is most responsible for rough mornings after drinking. All I do is drink a bottle before my first drink of alcohol, and then drink responsibly, pace myself with a good night's sleep, and I wake up in the morning feeling refreshed and ready to tackle the day. Tonight, I'm enjoying a beer my dad brought back from Mongolia and some Mongolian vodka, so I'm really glad I have some ZBiotics because I need to wake up bright-eyed and bushy-tailed tomorrow to do barbecue dad stuff. How does it work? Well, when you drink, a toxic byproduct of alcohol builds up in your unprepared gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that causes you to feel terrible the next day after drinking. ZBiotics produces an enzyme, like the one your liver uses, to break down this byproduct. This is real science that works. It's not like random plant extracts or off-the-shelf ingredients. But does it actually work, you might ask? Yes, it does. I find personally it eliminates that extra layer of grogginess I get when I wake up after a night of drinking, and I do feel noticeably more refreshed when I have a ZBiotics before I start drinking the night before. But if you're still skeptical, go ahead and try it yourself risk-free. There's a 100% money-back guarantee if you don't like it. Now, you can get ZBiotics for 15% off with my code. I recommend getting the 6-pack, which is what I got, and it's a great deal. You'll have a couple of extra to share with friends. Click the link in the description box below and use code SMOKETRAILSBBQ at checkout, or go to zbiotics.com/SMOKETRAILSBBQ and get 15% off your first order today. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is flip the brisket over and apply the rub to the bottom side first. That way, when I flip it back over, we can have a nice even layer of rub on the presentation side that's not getting all messed up by the cutting board. A lot of folk like to use mustard as a binder for their brisket. I do as well, but I found that water, good old-fashioned H2O, as Bobby Boucher would say, is actually a really good binder because it results in a better bark in a lot of cases. So we can spritz that down with some water, and then we can apply our kosher salt. You can use whatever type of kosher salt that you want. Just make sure you get a nice even layer, kind of like this. So it's almost like a speckling. You'll know it's over-salted if it's completely white with salt. You want to get your edges. And then we'll switch over to our coarse-grained pepper. We'll just do a nice layer. Okay, let's open up the taps here with this guy. Nice even layer. I like to go really thick on the pepper because the pepper is going to help your bark a lot because it's already pretty dark and it's kind of a neutral tasting piece of rub that you can put on the brisket that soaks up that smoke and the darkness of the fire and the smoke without putting extra salt on it. I know that doesn't make much sense because pepper isn't really neutral in flavor, but over the course of a long cook, it loses a lot of its edge, gets diluted, gets cooked. A lot of those oils in the pepper that give it its pepperiness are going to run off. They're going to mix together with other juices. They're going to fall out into your drip pot. So don't worry about over peppering your brisket. Okay, looking good. Now we're going to flip it over and we're going to do the same thing on the top. So I'll give it a spritz of water. And we'll give it a nice even coating of salt. Again, this is coarse grain salt. Don't use table salt. Table salt is a lot saltier. Kosher salt is the way to go. Thick layer of pepper. All right, this brisket is fully rubbed. Now the next step is to put it on my smoker, which I've started with my grill gun. This is a really awesome tool to start your firebox fire in less than 60 seconds. Really awesome investment if you're looking at doing offset smoking long term because it starts your fire really quickly. You don't have to deal with a charcoal chimney that produces a lot of smoke and bothers your neighbors. This thing produces a nice, hot, clean burning fire almost within a minute or two after you've hit it with 60 seconds of this grill gun. I'll leave a link in the description section below if you guys want to check it out. The smoker has been preheated to 225 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm placing my brisket with the point facing the fire. That point is a lot thicker. It's got more intramuscular fat. It's got more fat on it. So it's going to take the brunt of all of that heat and it's going to allow the brisket to cook a lot more evenly. So point towards the firebox, put in a probe if you want to so you can monitor the temperature, and just ensure that you are running a steady 225 to 250 degree fire until the next step. After about 4 or 5 hours, you're going to hit the temperature zone of between 140 to 165 internal. And at that point, the brisket is going to start evaporating a lot of moisture. That evaporative cooling is going to cool down the brisket and it's going to result in what's called the stall. The stall is when the brisket starts losing a lot of moisture, it's sweating out a lot of its water weight, and it's not hot enough in the smoker to overcome the evaporative cooling effect. So you get this effect where the brisket actually stops cooking for a while or cooks very slowly. So there's a couple ways to get around that. You could wrap it at this point, but that's not the method we're going for in this video. We're going for maximum Texas style bark in this video. So what we're going to do is we're going to ramp up the temperatures to between 250 to 275 when you see that brisket starting to sweat out a lot of moisture. The reason the brisket can handle this increased temperature at this point is because all of that moisture that the brisket is now sweating out is going to protect it from drying out. If you ramped your temperatures to 250 to 275 from the beginning of the cook, you might notice that your flat is getting a little bit dry. So that's why I like to start out really slow until the brisket starts sweating a lot, which normally happens in the 140 to 165 zone. When it starts looking really wet, it's sweating out a lot, and it's within that temperature zone, that's when you know to ramp it. And after a few hours maintaining that higher pit temp, I'll check on my brisket, usually when the brisket is around 170 internal, and I'll flip it around and foil the edges of the flat. This is optional, but it keeps the edges of the flat protected and also exposes the fat on the top of the flat to the heat source, which will help with properly rendering the fat. And finally, when the brisket hits 185 to 190 degrees internal, I take a look at it. If the color is super dark, the fat cap is squishy, it kind of gives way when you poke into it, and the brisket is relatively tender when I probe into it, then I know it's time to wrap. If you don't care to remember all that, then just wait until the internal temperature hits 190 and then pull it off the smoker. It'll be fine because any extra toughness still left in the brisket is going to be completely eliminated by the next step of this particular method, which is the wrap and hold. The first part of this step is to wrap your brisket in butcher paper. If you have a wide roll of paper, then you'll only need one sheet, but if you have a skinny roll like I have here, then you'll need to lay down 2 lengths. You'll coat the butcher paper in some beef tallow. That's going to lock in a lot of the moisture, keep the brisket juicy, and it's also going to allow it to breathe a bit so the bark doesn't get soggy. Then pour some additional tallow on top of the brisket and wrap it up tightly. Once you're done that, it goes into a deep aluminum pan with half a cup of water added. It gets tightly sealed with a double sheet of aluminum foil, and it goes in the oven at 150 degrees Fahrenheit, or as low as you can get it. Most ovens only go to 175, but they often have temperature adjustment settings where you can go -10 to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, and you can get it exactly at 150 degrees Fahrenheit. It's going to stay in the oven overnight for 10 to 16 hours. If you're the type of person that just wants the recipe, you want to know how to cook a perfectly cooked Texas-style brisket, feel free to skip to the next section. I'll tell you exactly how to do that. But if you're a brisket nerd like me, then this is the section for you, because I'm going to explain some of the concepts in this video and why I did things. So first thing I want to explain is this method is best suited for a prime grade brisket or a choice grade brisket at the very least. Don't try it with a select grade brisket. Select grade briskets don't hold up very well with the long hold method in the oven. They tend to dry out a little bit because they don't have a lot of fat. So go with at least a choice and ideally a prime. Get the best brisket you can afford, basically. Now, why am I going all the way up to 190? Why aren't I wrapping it at around 165 or 170 like I normally would once I got some decent bark? The reason is I want to go for awesome looking bark. You often see on Instagram or in barbecue restaurants in Texas, these super dark meteorite looking briskets. And that's what I'm really trying to replicate here. And I find that it often takes a lot higher temperature internally in the brisket to get that bark on the outside of the brisket. If you wrap it at 165, 170, it's relatively dark, but it's not that deep black dark that you see on a lot of Texas style briskets. So I find taking it to 190, especially because prime grade briskets and choice grade briskets, they can handle that sort of internal temperature before you wrap it. That's kind of the ideal temperature for when I start to see the bark getting super dark. And the other reason I wanted to take it up to 190 is because I wanted to make a really easy to follow, kind of foolproof method for making a perfect Texas style brisket that is very similar or even better than one you could get at a Texas barbecue restaurant. And the way that we do that is by taking it to 190 and getting close enough to the finishing temperature, but not quite there. If you probe into it at 190, it's probably not going to be probe tender like I normally would with my briskets that I finish up to, 195, and then I hold them in that temperature zone for a long time until they get super tender and buttery, and then I pull them and rest them for 2 hours. It doesn't even matter how tough or how tender it is, because you're going to be finishing it by holding it in the oven at 150 for the next 10 to 16 hours. That is going to eliminate any of the toughness that might be remaining in the brisket. And I find that that long hold often eliminates any of the guesswork of having to probe for tenderness or anything like that. I've pulled briskets at 180, 185, 190, 195, 200, that whole temperature zone, and I've put them in the oven for 10 to 16 hours at 150, and they always turn out perfectly cooked. It's like the magical silver bullet for cooking brisket. I'm convinced that it is actually the biggest secret for cooking brisket that has not really hit the mainstream. I know a lot of people know about it because a lot of brisket restaurants, barbecue joints in Texas, like Franklin Barbecue, they hold their briskets in proofing ovens that are kind of temperature and moisture controlled. But I really do think that is the secret. It's kind of like reverse sous videing your brisket. You're cooking your brisket up to 190, getting a super good bark, and then you're just throwing it in the proofing oven and letting it slowly finish over the course of 10 to 16 hours and melt all those collagen fibers while also not getting too overcooked. And I think it's important for us as brisket cooks to learn how to properly hold a brisket for a long period of time at 150 degrees Fahrenheit, because that's how the best barbecue joints in the world are turning out world-class briskets. And the way that I get such precision temperature control in my oven is by using my ThermoWorks signals. I have some ambient probes on the outside of the pan, because a lot of times the thermometer on the oven is inaccurate. So I'll gauge that, then I'll drop the temperature to its lowest setting of 175. I have an adjustment on my oven, so I dial it down another -10 degrees, so it's effectively at 165 set temperature, but I find on my ThermoWorks signals, what it reads in ambient temperature is around 155 degrees Fahrenheit. That's what this precision instrument is kind of measuring right next to the brisket. The other factor is that brisket is in an aluminum foil pan and it's got some moisture in it. It's got half a cup of water. So it's not steaming or anything because it's only at 150 degrees, but it's still providing enough moisture in that sealed environment that you're getting some humidity. So that is preventing the brisket from drying out, and it's kind of simulating what you'd have in a Alto Sham at a barbecue restaurant that has temperature and humidity control. So we're getting that exact temperature control, that exact humidity control, and that temperature control and that humidity control is what's allowing us to render that collagen over a long period of time and get the perfect consistency of brisket after 10 to 16 hours instead of getting potentially an undercooked brisket or an overcooked brisket. You just get the perfect consistency of brisket, and it's almost a no-fail method to achieve that. Ooh, that's feeling tender. Thunk. Let's tear this guy open and see what we got here. Oh, baby. That is looking good. Oh man, it's so tender. Thunk number 2. Thunk. Just squeeze some of this tallow out. All of this juice. That is a nice looking brisket. All right, let's get to slicing. The first thing I like to do is, starting from the point, we'll landmark about halfway through the brisket, right about here, and we'll do a nice slice right where the point meets the flat here. Oh man, that's slicing like butter. This is gonna be good. This is gonna be really good. Let's take a look here. Whew! Look at that. That is a thing of beauty. Ladies and gentlemen, that is a Texas-style brisket that even Barbecue Jesus would be proud of. Look at all those juices. That is so juicy. Wow. And guys, the reason I'm squeezing these juices out, it isn't just for YouTube. I'm squeezing these juices onto the cutting board so that we can then dip the exposed end of the brisket onto these juices so that we can prevent oxidization. And as we are slicing into these halves of the brisket, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be soaking the brisket slices in this fat that we squeezed out onto the cutting board. That is going to make the slices taste a lot better. It's going to prevent them from oxidizing, and they're just going to taste amazing and look amazing when you serve them up to your family. So now I'm taking 1/4-inch slices. I'm letting the knife do the work. Really sharp, long knife helps for this. I like to use a smooth knife. A lot of people like to use a serrated knife, but I like the smooth knife mainly because it doesn't mess up my cutting board. I find the serrated knives kind of cut through my cutting board really quickly and mess it up. And this is kind of curved as well, so you can chop it like that, and it's really handy for getting through the bottom of the brisket without tearing anything. So there is a perfect slice of the flat. Look at how nice that is. Barky, it's juicy, it's tender, it looks amazing. Let's pull this apart. Well, first of all, I'll bend it on my finger. That's kind of table stakes. Look at that. That just bends over, and it's still holding itself together. That is an indicator of a good brisket. Bends completely over on itself, doesn't fall apart. Now I'm going to pull it apart, and it just pulls apart like nothing. Let's give this a taste. Oh, so good. So amazingly good. It's smoky, the bark is perfect, it's crunchy. The meat is perfectly cooked. That long rest or the long hold in the oven at 150, that's what makes these briskets, guys. Don't skip that step. That is so key. It just makes briskets so much better. Oh, man. You can taste the pepper, you can taste the salt, and despite all the pepper I put on it, it's not very pepper forward. I don't really get a huge hit of pepper. Oh man, that's good. Okay, let's keep slicing this. So continuing with the flat, we're doing nice 1/4-inch slices, being careful not to screw up the bark. We don't want to go too far in with this style of knife because when you push back out, you can hit it with a part of the knife that isn't sharp, and it can push out some of the fibers and it'll shred the brisket. So we don't want to do that. Letting the knife do the work. And when I get to the bottom, it sometimes gets a little bit of resistance. So I just finish it by kind of chopping through it. Again, with this knife, it's got a bit of that bend, which is really handy for that. And the result is you get perfect slices. And then, as I was saying before, you just drag it through the juices on the cutting board, and then you'll put it to the side wherever you're plating it up. And I'll just continue on doing that with all of the flat. Slice through the end. Sometimes I do 2 at a time. And as you make these slices, you're exposing more meat to the air, which is going to result in oxidization, and it's going to turn the brisket a weird looking color. So that's another reason that we give it a little bath in this tallow. And guys, just look at how juicy that is. All of that juiciness, that's caused by that long hold at 150 that we did in the oven. It just takes all of the guesswork out of cooking brisket and making a perfect brisket, regardless of what temperature you pull it at. As long as it's in the 180 to 190, 195 zone when you pull it, the long hold will just finish the brisket perfectly. Now, as I get to the end of the flat here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start kind of tapering the cuts like this, so that it's going to be thinner on this edge and it's going to be thicker on this edge. And that's just to get some more slices out of this thing. Otherwise, I'll just get smaller and smaller slices until the slices are just super tiny. And with this little guy right here, it's not a burnt end because it doesn't have a lot of fat in it. It's more of like a burnt end of the flat. So what I do is I just chop that up and I'll slather it in as much tallow as possible. But I won't give them to my guests as the first thing they eat because they are a bit dry. So I usually leave them for last or hide them somewhere. Now, moving on to the point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut off the burnt ends. So maybe about 1 inch into the point, I'll make a slice. And I'll just soak that in tallow to oxidize it, to prevent the oxidization a little bit. And then I'll go in here and I'll just make some chops. There we go, that's a burnt end. That's a burnt end, a little bit fatty, but that's okay. This one, I'll cut it right there. Not too much fat on it, still good. This one, not bad. This one, a little bit fatty, but still has some meat on it, so that's pretty decent. Put that over there. And now I'm just gonna make slices. So again, 1/4 inch slices. You can go a little bit thicker, maybe just over 1/4 inch on the point, but I think 1/4 inch is just fine. And there it is, folks. That is a fully sliced Texas style brisket. If you guys want an example timeline of how long it might take to smoke one of these briskets using this technique, then aim for around 12 to 14 hours during the first part. So that's smoking your brisket up to 190 and then wrapping it in tallow-soaked butcher paper. Once you put it in the oven, it's going to take another 10 to 16 hours. It needs at least another 10 hours. So what I like to do is I get up on Saturday morning at a pretty leisurely time. I'm not getting up super early in the morning. I might get up around 8 a.m. I'll get my brisket on the smoker and then I'll just relax and smoke it all day, all the way up until 10, 11 p.m. at night. And then I'll take it off, I'll wrap it in butcher paper, throw it in the oven, and then I'll wait 10 to 16 hours until either lunch the next day, or I can even wait as long as until dinner the next day for Sunday dinner. And that is how I get a perfect Texas style brisket without sacrificing any sleep and still having lots of time to spend with my family on the weekend. Guys, if you enjoyed this video, then consider joining my Patreon page. I'll link it in the description section below. There's a bunch of brisket nerds like me there, and we're talking about how we can make brisket better and how we can make our barbecue better every single day. I really like it when my Patreon followers will ask me questions and take photos of their cook that they're doing on a certain day, and I can kind of troubleshoot and help them through certain issues, and everyone kind of jumps in and helps everyone out. It's a really great community, and I'm really enjoying it, so consider joining that, and I will see you guys in the next video. Happy smoking.